introduce the Rhinos.
I've been crying, boo-hoo, 'cause I'm lonely for you. Smiles have all turned to tears. It won't wash away the fear that you never ever return. This is a fire that keeps me crying, baby, for you. Keeps me crying, baby, for you. So won't you hurry? Come on, boy, and see about me. Come see about me. See about you, baby. Come see about me. You want to know me now. Come see about me.
Thank you to our performers, Anya, Jalen Jenkins, Alexis Strouder, Yakira Beard. Their bios are in your programs. You're going to hear a lot more about them tonight in tonight's programs. Wonderful artists, rising stars working and living on the West Side. What you were seeing just now is a glimpse of some of the wonderful art and cultural work that's emerging in West Side neighborhoods, and this often goes unnoticed. So tonight we're trying to draw attention to some of those really innovative projects that are happening throughout West Side neighborhoods. And this performance, or this glimpse into this performance, is particularly special because it's a sneak preview for their debut performance that's going to happen next week on June 24th at Silent Funny in West Humboldt Park. So you're going to hear more details about that as well and the time. But I want to thank Sarah Beth Woods, who's one of our panelists, and her team, the performers, the choreographer, and costume designers, for organizing this sneak preview for us. And she will tell you more about it. I also want to thank all of our panelists, who I will introduce shortly, and our phenomenal Hull-House staff, especially Ross Jordan and Tara Brown, who have helped a great deal with this project and the extensive programming, and also Can TV for covering the program tonight. I want to welcome you all to the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum. My name is Jennifer Scott, and I'm the director here at the museum and the moderator for the evening. Before I introduce our fantastic roster of speakers, I want to share a little bit about the museum and the Making the West Side project that this program is a part of tonight. The museum is a part of the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And the museum is a tribute to Jane Addams, who's the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and the other social reformers during the Progressive Era who moved into the near West Side to found the Settlement House in 1889 in an area that was considered a slum and at the time was inhabited by a large immigrant population. So Addams and the social reformers lived and worked on the West Side of Chicago with their neighbors who were struggling with poverty, racism, gender oppression, and unregulated labor. Addams and the residents of Hull-House fought for social change, for women's right to vote. They advocated for better housing, fair labor practices, for full citizenship rights, for immigrants, public health, public education, recreational and public space, public arts, free speech, and they greatly impacted public policy. Today, all that we do here at the museum connects this history to present-day social justice issues, carrying on this focus in all of our exhibitions, programs, research, and education initiatives. We are gathering today in one of two of the remaining historic buildings of what was originally a 13-building settlement Next door is our main building, which is the museum, so we invite you all to come back and see our exhibitions. We have history exhibitions as well as rotating contemporary art exhibitions. Currently, we have an exhibition called States of Incarceration that is exploring the carceral state and mass incarceration. It's a partnership with DePaul University, the Inside Out program, and the Humanities Action Lab in New York at the New School. So we invite you to come back and see all that we do there. This building itself that we're in has its own special legacy. It is the historic residence dining hall. And almost 130 years ago, it was used for pretty much the same purpose that we use now. It was a place for people to gather and debate social issues of the day, usually around food, and we usually have meals here. Notable people such as Ida B. Wells Burnett, Eleanor Roosevelt, W. Du Bois, Gertrude Stein, all gathered here to discuss critical issues of the day and to plot innovative solutions to create a more just and peaceful world. So we're in the right place tonight. What is Making the West Side project about? In connection to the Hull-House history, some questions that we are asking with the Making the West Side project are, how can we become better neighbors to one another? And how can we become better change agents and work together to create the neighborhoods that we want to see, live in, and sustain together? When I first came to Chicago, which was just a little over 2 years ago now, I was stunned and disturbed by the invisibility of the West Side and the stigmas associated with the West Side. Also, the very, very dominant North Side, South Side narrative that doesn't leave a lot of room for visibility or discussions about the distinctiveness of the West Side. Since then, we've been trying at the museum to understand and learn more about these gaps and distortion and our own location in this history. While the museum is known for its robust public programming and social change focus, it was physically and philosophically separated from the West Side. As you could probably see, we're not really in a neighborhood anymore. When it became part of the University of Illinois Chicago in the 1960s. In response, the museum has been using neighborhood history to help West Side community partners contextualize and address contemporary issues. As a result, in 2016, Jane Addams Hull-House Museum was one of 21 recipients nationally of a National Endowment for the Humanities Award that allowed us to create Making the West Side, community conversations on neighborhood change. Building on the tradition of the Hull-House Settlement's work for the common good, this initiative allows the museum for the first time to deeply investigate our historic role in neighborhood change and situate both the historical and contemporary West Side of Chicago in a national dialogue on race, gentrification, and the American city. The project includes the development of new digital and educational initiatives, a public forum which we had all day last spring, a week-long Teachers Institute where we worked with educators from around the city, and community conversations across the West Side. And this year we've been continuing those monthly, and tonight is one of those. Making the West Side uses two critical decades of change as touchstones into pressing questions facing Chicago's West Side neighborhoods. In the beginning years of the Hull-House settlement, in 1889 to 1899, the social reformers conducted an unprecedented sociological neighborhood study where they collected survey data and used it to affect social change. The resulting Hull-House Maps and Papers project offered an important set of published essays and maps focused on understanding the makeup of the neighborhood. This study was intentionally done by the social reformers of Hull-House to impact social change, to create social change from understanding or deeper understandings of what's happening in our neighborhoods. The other touchstone era that we ground the project in are the last years of Hull-House. The final years of Hull-House in 1954 to about 1963 saw the destruction of the Hull-House settlement to make way for the University of Illinois Chicago, as well as the demolition of many public housing projects. In addition, local West Side communities were displaced as a part of urban renewal, and local and federal discriminatory housing policies created ethnic and racial disparity. Both eras of change have profoundly influenced the major issues facing the West Side today. And yet, there are few forums to connect these histories to our contemporary moment. Historically, the west side of Chicago is a space of disparate neighborhoods, largely segregated by economic and racial difference. The Hull-House neighborhood, which is very different from today, I'm sure you know, in the 1890s, included immigrants from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with the largest populations from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, Bohemian, and many other nationalities of people who lived within several blocks of the settlement in 1891. In the 1910s and 20s, the Hull-House neighborhood began to receive Mexican immigrants following the Mexican Revolution and African-American migrants from the U.S. South. Today's West Side is also home to a diverse range of racial and ethnic groups with markedly different historical and social formations. Today's West Side is also starkly segregated, representing sizable wealth, housing, employment, education, and racial disparities. In addition, gentrification threatens to continue to creep west and displace communities and cherished memories. This rapid neighborhood change occurs with little cross-neighborhood interracial discussion, with little grounding in West Side history. So this project, Making the West Side, allows us to bring together people across neighborhoods, excuse me, on the West Side, including scholars, activists, artists, and others, to discuss the historic and current issues facing the area. The museum, along with our partners, has been producing powerful discussions and public programming covering issues such as racism, white flight, redlining, urban renewal plans and policies that have negatively impacted West Side Black, Italian, Jewish, Greek, Mexican neighborhoods, exploring 120 years of social change. Our discussions have included why people continue to remain and fight for these communities today, often against forces of regentrification in the highly segregated city of Chicago. So tonight, oops, that was our interlude. That was a good transition. So tonight, we are going to be highlighting the work of emergent artists, curators, and art initiatives in the West Side of Chicago, in West Side Chicago neighborhoods, including Pilsen, Little Village, North and South Lawndale, and Austin, and really try to think about how place or locatedness informs arts and activism on the West Side. We are going to explore connections between art and social change on the West Side, and the intention is to draw attention to some of the inequities and how arts is trying to address some of these in neighborhoods and make histories and people of the West Side more visible. So, with that, I want to call up our panel. I'm just going to read everybody's bios at once, and then we'll go into the discussion. So, our first panelist and cherished colleague and friend, Tracie D. Hall, is the director of the Joyce Foundation's Culture Program, which supports arts organizations in Chicago and the Great Lakes region that commission and exhibit work by artists of color, employ people of color at all levels, and regularly offer programs with richly diverse expressions of 21st century creativity. Tracie is also the founding curator of Rootwork Gallery, which she will talk about tonight, a new experimental art space which features artistic expression around healing, reconciliation, and the investigation of folk, street, and indigenous cultures. Before her Joyce Foundation appointment, Tracie was most recently Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, also known as DCASE, for the city of Chicago, where she oversaw the Arts and Creative Industries Division, which included the visual arts, performing arts, music industry, and farmers market programs, as well as the Chicago Film Office, Chicago Artists Month, and Lake FX Summit and Expo. Deeply invested in the intersection of arts access, literacy, youth, and economic development, Tracie led the organization and founding of the New York City Early Learning Network, developed the Seattle-based Scribes program, which has become a long-running youth creative writing project, conceived and curated the NIH-funded Festival of Caribbean Literature with the Connecticut Center for the Book, served as author and principal investigator on 3 milestone Institute of Museum and Library Science grants, and in Chicago has worked on several initiatives positioning art at the intersection of workforce development and public safety. She's also a poet, fiction writer, and playwright, very busy, obviously. Also a Cave Canem Fellow and the recipient of various awards and residencies for her writing, creative, and community work. Please join me in welcoming Tracie Hall. Okay, our next panelist is Nicole Marroquin, also another wonderful colleague. Nicole is a transdisciplinary artist, strategist, researcher, concerned parent, very important, and faculty in the Department of Art Education at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her essays are included in the Chicago Social Practice History book series, Revista Contratiempo, and Area Chicago magazine, and her work is in the permanent collection of the National Museum of Mexican Art. Nicole presents her research at national conferences, including the College Art Association, the National Art Education Association, National Latino Studies, Latino Art Now. In 2015, Nicole was invited to present research at the University of Chicago in conjunction with the exhibit, The City Lost and Found, Capturing New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980. And at the Art Institute of Chicago for the symposium, The Wall of Respect and the People's Art since 1967, which is enjoying an anniversary, a 50th anniversary. Recently, she was a Joan Mitchell Fellow at the Center for Racial Justice Innovation, a Propeller Fund awardee, and artist in residence at Mana Contemporary with the collective Multiuso. In 2011, she received the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Women of Excellence Award for service to the community from the National Museum of Mexican Art. In 2015, she was awarded tenure at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago. Most recently, Nicole has enjoyed a residency and exhibition with artist Andrea L. Hernandez at the Chicago Cultural Center, and the exhibition was called Historical Frictions, which she will talk about today. Please join me in welcoming Nicole. Last but not least, you sort of met. Sarah Beth Woods is a cross-disciplinary artist who explores femininity through material culture, artifice, and adornment. Woods' background as a painter, community activist, and fashion enthusiast has led to an interest in modern surfaces, specifically saturated color and shine, skin and hair, and the way it signifies shapes and communicates facets of our identity. Sarah Beth studied at the San Francisco Art Institute, where she focused on assemblage and interdisciplinary studies before returning to Chicago, where she earned a BFA at Northern Illinois University and her MFA at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work has been included in shows at the University of Michigan, Work, Detroit Space, UICA Grand Rapids, Girls Club, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and many, many, many more places. Sarah Beth's work was recently published in the Chicago Tribune. New City magazine named her one of the top 5 subversively conceptual crafters in Chicago in 2014. Sarah Beth and Fatimata Traore, a professional hair braider, are the recipients of the 2015-2016 Crossing Boundaries Prize through Arts and Public Life and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Sarah Beth is the 2017 3 Arts 3AP awardee, which supports Hear the Glow of Electric Lights, a film and performance-based project investigating 1960s American music groups featuring teenage girls and young women. And that's what you heard a glimpse of tonight, so you're going to hear a lot more about that. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Beth. So we're going to start off with Tracie. Each of the panelists have prepared just a little introduction about their work and the connection of their current projects to the West Side. And so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
All right.
So I have 10 minutes to sort of introduce you to Rootwork Gallery, and to talk about, I think, its positionality on the West Side, and why that is significant and why that has been significant in its evolution. But before I launch into that and tear through just some images that I hope will sort of underscore what I'm saying, but then also stand in the place of words that may fail me. I want to just thank Hull-House Museum and the whole team, Jennifer, Ross, and Tara, for the invitation and the logistics and the setup and the welcome, and making sure that I have the opportunity to tell the story and connect with you, some of whom I've never met before. And I'm hoping that in the spirit of Jane Addams, that something here, not just in what I'm saying, but that is what is said collectively, and the questions will sort of light a spark that kind of leads to a level of, reminds us again, just puts us in touch with our own humanity, and then also to maybe inspires us to dig deeper and do work that we feel really called to do. So it is really that goal that inspired Rootwork Gallery. And I started with this song. I tend to be one of those people, my family's from Louisiana on both sides. So that means a lot of times that I'm sort of always having this conversation, one foot in sort of the kind of like grounded world, the material world, and then also another foot really always listening to information from the other side. And the reason why I say that is because when I was very young, people would say all the time that you walk with so many people, and I would think, well, what does that mean? And as I got older and people really began to say it, and I really began to understand what they mean or meant when they said it, I really became more comfortable. And so one of the things that I think has defined even my professional work over the last, I would say, 10 years has been this desire to deeply integrate sort of the spiritual and the ancestral information into my everyday practice. And you wouldn't think that's radical, but we live in a world where, in some cases, it's different, definitely. But when I was getting ready to come back to Chicago to take the job that brought me back to Chicago, I'd come to Chicago about almost 15 years ago, and I was here and very happy, and then I decided to disrupt that a little bit and to go back to the East Coast where I'd come from, even though I'm from South Central Los Angeles. But when I was getting ready to come here, I had a dream, and in that dream there were a lot of people singing, and I can't remember exactly the tone of the sort of notes of the song, but the words were, "When you enter, leave the gate open." When you enter, leave the gate open. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about the origin story of Rootwork Gallery, something that I think of as a Black curatorial practice in collaboration with the ancestors. So Rootwork doesn't have a website, it doesn't have a sign hanging off the wall, it doesn't have a lot of things, it's very underground. And it's kind of underground in terms of you kind of have to either know about it to even know to begin to look for it, and that's really by design. I grew up in and around South Central Los Angeles. My grandparents had come to LA from Grand Canyon, Louisiana in the late 40s, really for many of the same reasons why we have a lot of people of colors, particularly Black folks, who came to Chicago looking for jobs and also looking to flee really oppressive racial politics. And growing up on the south side of Los Angeles, to me, is very much, there's an energy that has always made me feel at home on the west side. So I always say that in Los Angeles, the west side of LA, where you have a little bit more affluent Black folks, all working class, but a little bit more affluent, pockets of really big affluent, reminds me a lot of the south side of Chicago, whereas the South Central LA reminds me a lot of the west side of Chicago. And I've had friends tell me when I first came here, I would be on the west side. I lived on I lived in Humboldt Park, Ukrainian village, Humboldt Park. I lived right at that border. But folks would be like, I would be so deep on the west side all the time. They'd be like, are you from here? Because, only, folks who are from Chicago know about this particular place. This is my grandmother. And my grandmother is the reason why I opened Rootwork. So my grandmother was a very quiet woman. She was an aspiring hat designer, I think, at some point in her younger life. By the time she'd had children and settled in Los Angeles, she was really bent on, just staying alive and keeping her children alive and really learning how to do the kinds of things that were necessary to survival, both in rural Louisiana, but also in urban Los Angeles, particularly in Watts, which was unincorporated. And much of that involved medicinal practice. So Rootwork is named for my grandmother because, I remember thinking that if you got really sick, that everybody went to their grandmother's house, that she would slice sweet potatoes and put them between their fingers and tie their fingers together, and that she would tie a paper bag around their neck, and they would have a very deep sleep, and when they woke up, they were healed. So I imagine that just happened all around, and I remember having a lot of serious things happen, and our family just didn't go to the hospital. My grandmother was really quietly a noted healer, but I imagine that everybody had those types of domestic practices in which healing was a part of it. It was only when I got older and realized that, people were going to the hospital all the time or went to the hospital for different things, I realized, well, maybe my family is slightly different. But my grandmother also, when I was about 16, she tried to teach me how to work root. So, and again, I'm not talking about something that's esoteric or feels kind of like, there's all kinds of different words for it, but she literally took me out into the yard and she talked about different types of things that would help women if their pregnancies were going on, that would help you if there were certain types of things that were happening. And I remember at some point I just stopped listening because I wanted to be cool, and to be 16 or 17, I didn't necessarily want to be a root worker like my grandmother. But when I got into my late 20s, my grandmother began to visit me in a series of dreams, and she began to give me the recipes over again. And it was then that I knew that as part of my own artistic practice, because I was a writer and an artist and a playwright and really working across disciplines, I knew that at some point I put in my pocket that I would have a prolonged conversation with my grandmother in which she sort of applied her teachings to, and I sort of applied them to an art or curatorial practice. So Rootwork happened maybe a little bit sooner than I thought that it would. Here we have honey money, and honey money is just a way to sort of attract prosperity. You have honey and cinnamon and pennies and dollars in the bottom of a jar, and it's just a very easy sort of practice. And the more that you kind of like go around the world, the more you realize that everybody, especially when you're moving into a new space, that many cultures have things that you do before you inhabit that space in order to ensure not just financial prosperity, but that the experience of inhabiting the home will be something that feels fruitful and productive for your goals and your desires. So I'm just wondering, does anyone have like a practice of something that you might do to attract abundance, or something that you learned from your family members? Anybody here? Okay, well then I'm glad I'm here. I'm in the right place. Honey money. Rootwork also, too, is a place for me to express what I think of as being sort of like syncretic spiritual beliefs. Part of my own sort of life story has been that I've traveled so much and lived so many different places inside of the U.S. and outside of the U.S. And because I consider myself in some ways probably destined to be a magnet for information about various spiritual practices, I have sort of collected and integrated spiritual practices into my own way that I sort of operate. And it's just second nature for me. And so Rootwork in the gallery, there's always a, what I'm not going to even call it an altar, but there's always sacred space. And it becomes a part of the exhibition or the show, if you will, but it's always there and it's constantly changing, and it's information that's just being received. In this particular particular case, you have a lot of oranges here. And oranges sort of represent in different types of traditions, either life or love or hope or sweetness. And so you see that. Sarah Beth Woods, who we're going to hear from a little bit later, she was one of the first people that I showed in the gallery while I was still trying to figure it out. I decided to settle in Pilsen because it had a gallery district that was actually waning. So when I'd been in Chicago earlier, it was just, Pilsen had become, maybe this place where you had a lot of bustling art galleries. And when I returned from the East Coast, that was waning. And I remember feeling, because I think so opposite to maybe how other people think, when things are sort of flowing, for some reason, I kind of stay away because I don't like to be kind of caught up or swept up in things that are extremely popular for some reason. But I'm attracted to things when I feel like they may need some rebirth. And so I really wanted to be in Pilsen, but I also wanted to be outside of Halstead. And so to be back a little bit in the space at 645 West 18th is a little bit away. And I wanted to also figure out how to develop a curatorial practice where I was listening to both what I was seeing and what was attracting me, but also getting more information about it. And so one of the things, you'll hear a little bit more about Sarah Beth, it was not just one artist. It was the fact that Sarah Beth was in conversation with Fatima, who she may talk a little bit more about in building like a sculptural practice that was also based on sort of like hair techniques and the way that African and Black women have sort of adorned themselves traditionally that I was interested in. And I was also interested in her interpretation of that, being someone who was raised in a household, a German-American household, where many of the women were also involved in hairdressing. And so it was that combination that really inspired me. And here you have the sort of like group exercise around sort of working the hair and playing with dyed Kanekalon hair. The next artist that I would show is Victor Lee Gibbons, who is someone whose practice is very close to my curatorial practice because he's also interested in African spiritual traditions from the Deep South, where his family is from, Texas, from Brazil, and from Cuba. And so we came together that way. He was really interested in this idea of medicine and root work. So one of the things that happened with Victor is that even before people would see the exhibition or before we would open the doors, he actually dressed each of the walls with medicine, with traditional medicine and brick dust. And so the process became a very big part for me. There's this way that a lot of artists begin more and more as the space grows to almost know to create a conversation with the space, to set some intentions with the space, and to do ritual work in the space before we even open the doors. And it's just interesting because sometimes I'll see reviews that people post on social media, and exactly what we said we wanted to happen with that show is what they'll say. So one show, we said we really want people to feel loved. We want people to feel cared for. After a certain rash of violence, we wanted the space to feel like a transformational healing space, like a womb or like a hug. And so many people would begin to say that. In Victor's show, what we're seeing here is that people who entered the show would begin to spontaneously pray. So people would cry, they would pray, and people would really kind of have these deep epiphanies or really interesting moments. And again, one of the things for me is just been very interesting to kind of see how people began to open up to some of these ideas. Andrea Sanchez is a young Latina artist who is really interested in topography and mapping. And so she was someone I was very interested in because I really wanted abstraction. But with her, I began to think about what is the call and response of a curatorial practice that says that the artist is doing the thing that they feel, and then the curator maybe responds and articulates that in a different way. So one of the things that began to happen is that as Andrea was really interested in the land and in how the land is reclaimed when it's abandoned, I began to think about other things that we put onto the land, especially things that we put in and landfills, and so many clothes, especially because clothes has become such a pollutant in our sort of like fast fashion type of environment. And so in addition to these really beautiful photographs that Andrea had taken of these abandoned areas around Chicago, and these maps where she had both integrated the natural topography as well as traced footsteps that she would take these really sort of like meticulous photographs of. In addition to that, all around you were walking on the top of clothes. And so people would be kicking and thinking like, well, who left their clothes around? But that was really intentional. The next show, Everyday Rituals, was a show that also was really important to me to begin to think about, because one of the things that I was experiencing at Rootwork is that people would say, oh, this is so special, this is so interesting. And what I really wanted to do was to think about the fact that when we talk about ritual, especially from here, it feels so special and so different and like, wow, who has time for that? What I wanted to talk about was the fact that we are engaging in ritual and setting intentions all the time. And we're doing that in the morning when we're cooking. We're doing that when we're washing our hair. We're doing that when we're washing clothes. We're doing that in service to each other. And so one of the things that I asked a photographer to do, who is, I think, a really important talent in Chicago, Tanika, was to begin thinking, Tanika Johnson, was to begin thinking about, especially in terms of Inglewood, where she's from Inglewood. And, people, and I knew what it was like growing up in South Central. People would say, I can't believe you're from South Central. You don't act like a person from South Central. And I was hearing that a lot about certain places in Chicago. So what I asked her to do was to take an entire day and to take photographs of people that she thought were engaging in ritual, and to present that in a gallery context. And we called that, and she was matched with the painter Adrian Power, and we called that exhibition Everyday Rituals. Here you'll see a little bit more of my curatorial technique, call and response. I was so moved by the photographs. I wanted one of the walls to be painted a very specific type of red, and we crushed and pasted carnations, dry carnations, into the wall. And so people would come and say, that's some very interesting wallpaper. And then they would walk closer and be like, are those flowers? And because that is such a painstaking and time-intensive process, it was our collective way and my way as a curator to say, you are loved and you deserve this to everyone who entered into the room. And then also, too, hair shows up again in Tanika's work, because hair is such an important ritual. And I went to the beauty supply and bought all of the products that you need if your hair is going to be fly, including Dax Grease and Ultra Sheen, which is being discontinued, I guess. I brought all the Ultra Sheens, and they were like, wow. Here again is a little bit more. We had oranges. Here's a woman at a lounge, the family lounge in Inglewood. And then again, here are ways that people would be really sort of like acting out this intention of love, just very spontaneously. I was inspired to set my own piece in 15 years called Making My Mother's Bed. One of the most profound loves that I've ever had in my life was my mother. She had me very late in life, and I think she really, maybe because of that, she was very open with her love to me, and she died early for me. She died when I was really in my early 20s, and the ritual of bed making, which was something that was very important to her, was something that I wanted to carry out. She died on July 13th, and so for 7 hours and 13 minutes, I made the bed repeatedly, I should say, for over several hundred times, and invited just a few people to assist in this brief ritual. And so that was one way that I've been inspired by the space to return to my own practice. And here's some images from that. Right now, if you were to pass Rootwork, you would see Bob Faust's Ways and Means, which is Bob Faust is a spatial artist, and passing the gallery, he would always say to me, those windows. And like I typically do in how I engage artists, I will say, what do you have for me? And over a series of nights, he sent words back and forth to me, and those words are now on the gallery. A young artist, Eric Clark, cut his own hair and began to apply the hair to portraits of students that he would have in his art classes, talking with them about that process. And it was his way, his ritual way of really sharing things that he really could not say. And so this is just an image of that. This is a prayer cloth and somebody spontaneously praying. These are kinds of things that happen. These last few photographs, I'm really also interested. This show is called Intercessions. And so I engage artists who are making work for the health and well-being of others. And that was really important for me, especially on the West Side and all the ideas that people have it. And here you see, I was talking to some folks, I turned around and these folks had just entered into this particular installation. So at Rootwork, you can't tell people too much, like you can't touch it because they just automatically will. And what they're looking at is an exhibition by a very young artist being shown for the first time in a gallery context, Maya Amina, in a piece called The Black Girl in Her Search for God, which deals with both mathematics and a lot of other things. Alana Parekh in Remember, A Journey into the Self, a very physical and amazing artist who really relived some ideas from her childhood as only 20 of us watched. And it was really one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen in not only Rootwork's context, but in period. The current show, if you were to come, is full of okra and pennies. It is called Diaspora, which is looking at what is the relationship that Chicago and Haiti have. It has it on so many different levels. There's an amazing painter, Alexandra Antoine. And then finally, my curatorial response to her work is to also think about the connections between my Louisiana of my background and some of our backgrounds in here, and to think about Haiti and to think about how we work with spirit. So when you come into the gallery, there's these very low mirrors, Ibeji, which have their own meaning. One takes the heat, the twins, one kind of stands in space for you, and candles. And everybody was coming in, as they would look at their feet, they would say, what do these mirrors mean? And the idea is not to give you the answer, but to allow you to ask. And so I think that is the way that my grandmother and I continue to have these conversations about not only what a gallery could be, not only what a gallery could be on the West Side, but how we dig into that deep and that deep soul, that funk and that flash, as Robert Farris Thompson would say. How do we use that to really transform the people who enter, and to ask them to sit quiet and to think deeply.
There we go. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks for setting this up. This is incredible. I'm so excited to, I'm hearing about everything going on with y'all, too. This is like the greatest way to find out what's happening. I'm just going to jump in really fast. My name is Nicole Marroquin, and I'm going to talk about a project I worked on called Historical Frictions. First I wanted to say, before I say things about specific projects, that my work is completely collaborative. The picture on the right is me with Andrea Sanchez, and he came up with the term historical frictions, and that was the name of a show we put on together at the Cultural Center. And he So I'm going to share some of the work I did with him. I'm going to share some of the work I did on public history with students at Benito Juarez and with teachers there too. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing most recently, recovering the history of women as cultural workers on the Lower West Side. But it all started when I found some photos on eBay, and insomnia, late night eBaying, did it to me. So I found this photo from 1968 of what appears to be a fight in the lunchroom at school, which happens to be my children's elementary school now. It's at 23rd and California. It was Harrison High School, and now it's Tepozcali and Salcedo. So I've been recently using historic photos for a series of silkscreen prints I could not, and I actually can't now understand why this history isn't super well known. Unlike like the student walkouts of Southwest, like in Los Angeles or Crystal City, because these images I found were really dramatic. And then it turns out the student organizers at Harrison had led citywide walkouts of 35 to 45,000 people, and they did it more than once. And this school was nearly half Mexican and Mexican-American too. Mexican-American people were categorized as white until 1972, and like my birth certificate says, I was born in 1970, says I was that I'm white, and because this was actually enabling school districts like Chicago to claim not to be segregated to avoid disrupting all white schools. And at Harrison, Mexican-American people actually had a 80% dropout rate. There were 0 Spanish speakers on the staff, minus 1 clerk who was actually interviewed a lot for this dissertation I've been leaning on. But I think this really important history of Black and Latinx organizing, radical solidarity work, youth-led organizing hasn't been written about very much, with the exception of this amazing paper I read by Deon Dance, who's here at University of Illinois. So the segregated histories of Black and Latinx student uprisings and agitation have been written, but they haven't been written together, right? But Rudy Lozano was actually a student at Harrison at the time, and so he probably learned coalition building at Harrison, or maybe he learned it at the Afro Arts Theater in between Earth, Wind, and Fire sets. We don't know, but we know that they went there for meetings, and so he was probably there. So it's screaming to be written about by a writer. Froebel was the 9th grade branch of Harrison, and it was at 21st and Damon in Pilsen, and it served primarily Latinx students, but it was slated for demolition on and off since the 40s. And I found this photo on eBay also. And so this is like around the time I became like fully obsessed. It was about 2014. So newspapers were really helpful in helping me fill in the gaps, but we don't have any archived Spanish language newspapers. And there were 4 that were reporting heavily on the Froebel uprising. So this photo on the left of the police officer with the smashed face is circulated nationally, and the event was reported on Channel 2 here. And I've heard about the dramatic footage of furniture flying out the windows when the building was shown in profile and cinder blocks flying out. But there's, other sides to the story as well. So Big, who's the smaller man in the picture, showed me the scars on his head from where the police officers hit him with batons. So the police severely beat students and protesters from the community, claiming that the principal was being held against his will, which wasn't true. And this officer that was hit with a cinder block in the face while attempting to get to the roof where students had, gathered all these bricks because they were waiting for a siege, like for weeks. They had been lighting fires on separate floors of the building for weeks. Several witnesses have told me now that they waited for 2 hours in an air-conditioned car for the press to arrive in order to get this photo. So it's not wasn't as dramatic as they had said. So actually, this is my photo, and I live about a block away from where the school had stood. So this is like where the foundation would have been. There's a metal fence, and I peeked through it, and I just stuck my phone up against it. I was like falling deeper and deeper into like must-know territory where I had to just ask everybody when I walked down the street with my dog. And so, and this had been a massive building at 21st and Damon, right? And so I was curious about why people didn't want to talk about it when I asked. So you can see the big building that's like in the upper corner on this side. You can see how much larger the building was than the rest of the neighborhood, right? So it was built in 1885, and at the time of the uprisings, it was the oldest building, school building in use in the city. So I found these photos, right? And on the back of this photo, it's actually dated 1948 and 1978, which is a possible clue to the demolition date, probably in 1978, because I haven't been able to find the demolition records, and for a building that big, that's really unusual. So
So I want to know more about like this lineage between the student-led movements, the interventions by the secret police that were called the Red Squad, whose files are now about this are located at the History Museum. And the police abuse inside of schools, all these things that were happening were virtually absent from all the accounts that I had heard. The account I heard was people marched at Froebel and then we got Benito Juarez School, which was like a little too simple. So I've been working on recovering the history of this school, but where I started was with this woman, Diana Solis. So for the past year, I've been working on her archives, and she's this super important and totally overlooked artist and cultural worker who lived in and grew up in Pilsen. She went to Harrison and Froebel too. So that picture on the right is her inside of Froebel, the first picture I've seen inside of the school ever, and I just found it like a month ago in her stuff. And that's her playing 45. She said she spun exclusively Motown, which is important. I'm like equally interested in that, right? So she's been really instrumental in organizing for and teaching at and documenting the early years of Mujeres Latinas en Acción, which is this anti-domestic violence organization founded in Pilsen. And she's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures from their initial years, but she also helped organize this Festival de Mujeres on 17th Street in Pilsen. And this is a photo of one of the bands that she booked. They were called Sister Blues and the Blue Jean Dyke Band. And she said that she was able to book this band because at the time nobody knew what the word dyke meant. So I've been working on identifying women who participated in the community mural movement, cultural production on all different kinds of, in all different sort of ways. You know, I'm really on alert looking for ways that people participated that we might not recognize, right? Because they're virtually absent from all accounts of community art and culture making. One person whose name just got, painted over in a mural at Benito Juarez High School is Malu Ortega y El Berro. And there's stills from some videos, but her name doesn't appear anywhere now. And so we think we may have found her on Facebook in Mexico, but people really don't care about Facebook, in some places. And I haven't been able to get a response from her, but it's exciting. We're getting closer. She was a really fantastic and exciting person that we're finding out about. And then last but not least is Sandra Mendes, who's one of 8 children of the legendary activist Lola Navarro, who was actually, has been credited by Rudy Lozano and for starting him out in activism. And Chuy Garcia also credits her with the beginning of his career in politics. So she's, Ms. Mendez is like a powerhouse. And her talking about her mother, I'll wait until she approves of what I was going to say. But there's some incredible stories about this woman who was not afraid of anything. And they started in South Chicago and then lived at Oakley and 21st for years. And now she lives in Little Village. So I just started going on meeting with her. But the way I found her was kind of interesting. I've been playing this documentary called Mi Raza, Portrait of a Family, which you can see online anytime. It's great. It's 30 minutes. But a friend of mine was watching it with me, Amanda Cortez. She actually works in the alderman's office for Munoz. And she was like, that girl in the movie was like 10-year-old looking girl. She goes, I swear I know her. That's because she looks exactly the same now. She's like a woman that comes into the office. And sure enough, she called her. She was like, yeah, that's me. She had never seen the movie. She had to stay home and babysit, I think, that day. So we got to, get her together and talk about this. So we just started recording and interviewing her. And it's really incredible. But just to kind of tie it all together and wrap up, so I'm not an historian, but I'm an expert amateur. So I've been learning about the ways that people do research, and one of the people I've been leaning on a lot is this Indigenous scholar, Linda Tuhiwai Smith from New Zealand. And she's got this incredible book, Decolonizing Methodologies, and this chapter of it called 25 Indigenous Projects has been really useful to me as I work, but also it's fantastic with the students really love it. So that's sort of a list paraphrased from her instructions on doing work in Indigenous communities. But one of the things we do is we ask, who's this? Where are the women? Who is that person? And then how do we work together to get to the answers and then get it out to people? So we've been studying a lot of photos, me and these students at Benito Juarez, and we've been using them as we interview people in the community too. So that was one of the things that came up was like, who's this woman in the center of this giant like police riot cop sandwich, right? How did she get there? It turns out it's Miss Mendez's sister. Anyway, like it's a small world. I showed her, she freaked out. She'd never seen the picture. I found that on eBay too. But talking with students, like they've got an incredible ability to read images and to understand what's going on. Like they read between the lines in a way that like I didn't teach. I'm just saying like I brought stuff to them and they were able to decipher things in a way that was beyond my knowledge. So, and I didn't politicize them. This is two of them keeping Trump out of our city. So, I showed up and they were already like super engaged, right? And I brought stuff to them and the timing was good. So the timing was so good that we were studying, or watching documentaries and looking at some primary sources about the walkouts in LA. And then there was a walkout at Benito Juarez at the same time, and it was student-led and it was amazing. So, I mean, a lot was handed to me in that way. So, just really super mega quick. I don't know if these will play. We'll try it. It should be silent. Students did a lot of work with some of these primary sources. We'll see, it may or may not play. What can you do? Nope. No go. Well, that's all right. Students were on the left. What they did was they built these giant barricades in the hallway, and then right at passing time, there was this scuffle where students were all trying to get through it. They took the pictures from the yearbooks of the ninth graders that actually had led the walkout and created these massive tangles of paper chains all the way throughout and made it so that people weren't able to pass through the hallways. And on the right, they took giant pictures of Froebel that had been, do you think they
I have this on it.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. No, they, that's all right. Thank you, though. They took one of the giant pictures of the Froebel with the riot police and then took it to the site where Froebel had been and tried to light it on fire. And then the neighbors came out, and then they were like, we got a letter to, I think it was sent to the principal or the alderman, I can't remember, but they said they need to stop doing those, rituals in front of our houses. And they were like, learn about Froebel. One of the people apparently had gone there, so they knew a lot about it. Anyway, the students were pretty jazzed. Wait, let's see. Oops, now I can't make it go. I pushed too many buttons. I apologize. Uh-oh. I did something bad. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Perfect. But so that was in 2015, but in fall 2016, if y'all have been around in Pilsen, there was a rash of fires that were set, burnt 7 people out of their homes and killed somebody. There's been the attacks on the synagogue downtown. That guy also lived in Pilsen. And then there's been, the string of immigration raids, and everything was different. The decision between me and Paulina Camacho, the art teacher, to go into the school and teach about the history and talk about police violence was it wasn't going to work, right? People were really terrified already, and it was a terrible month. I mean, the whole summer was terrible, right? And then moving into fall, and working with primarily immigrant students, it just wasn't going to be possible. So we actually moved into something that was more about the future, that was more about taking an active role and designing what we want to see in the future, especially in light of, the threats to the community and gentrification as a threat. And so what we did was, this past year, we worked with students who actually made models of their own homes, very tiny, 2-inch ceramic. So there was a total of 124. Then they started to come downtown to the cultural center, and they started to make some of the businesses. And then they also used collage to create, designs for possible homes. And during the course of this, there's like 125, so I probably won't show them all. But during the course of this, actually, students reported feeling like excited about forming design teams and writing proposals and, proposing a city that they could envision themselves in the future, which in itself was really radical. And they're really cool people, and they agreed to wearing uniforms and dressing up and doing fantastic stuff for me. And so really the thanks goes, the gratitude I'm feeling is to them for doing all this incredible work. Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to talk to you a bit about my current project. It's sort of interesting to be talking about a project that's not finished yet, but it's also exciting because you all get to come along in the journey with me a little bit. And I want to thank again Yakira, Alexis, and Anya so much. It's just incredible. You all make this incredible, and I'm really grateful. And the leotards look amazing. So Here the Glow of Electric Lights is a project that I started, in January. I started doing some fundraising for the project, and it was funded by a 3AP award, basically through 3 Arts, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit. And I had this vision of how I wanted the group to be. So my background, I actually have a sculptural background, and I also studied performance in school. And I was doing work with hair. I was making these really elaborate sculptures, which I've shown at Rootwork, and also doing some sort of engagement work where I was painting nails, and people were telling stories, and it was sort of this space for people to be able to just talk to one another and exchange ideas and touch one another in public. But the thing that really drew me to the girl groups was the height of the hair and the way it took up space, right? In a way where sometimes you can't articulate something, but you can sort of wear something or extend something in a way to really occupy space in a really interesting way. So this is a photo of the Rhinos. And so we started our group. We auditioned a couple people, and we've been rehearsing at Prosper High School, Prosper Career Academy in Belmont Cragen. And actually, Anya and Alexis and I all go to church there. So that's sort of how we got connected together. And Yakira, we got hooked up with through a friend of a friend, and she's amazing. She most recently was on Empire dancing. And so my idea for the Ronettes, it's that's sort of how it started. But as the group came together, and we were connected with our choreographer, Courtney Bradshaw, she's a choreographer, she started talking about how she was a self-professed quote-unquote finisher. So this idea of taking something that sort of started and putting the finishing touches on it. We talked a lot about Maxine Powell from Motown. And then as we got all of our different girls together, we're like, you know what, this is kind of turning into the Supremes. So we started to think a little bit about that, and obviously that's what the song and the routine is based on. Here's another image of the Rhinos. I had to include this one because of Jet and its Chicago connection. And also the sort of Nazi party slogan across the top, which was just like, how can't we just celebrate women and women of color and diverse ideas without having to sort of take away from it? I was just startled by that. And how overt a lot of these, I started looking at a lot of these covers, doing a lot of research about images, and text and subtext, right, that's being put out there in around 1964 and 1965. And then also thinking about the relationship to Chicago, right? So Martin Luther King coming here in 1966 to Marquette Park, and that the violence that ensued. So it's not, these groups aren't without tension. I'm aware of the tension and the respectability politics that are sort of embedded in all of it. But I think underneath all of it, my idea and my heart is to really celebrate and to really appreciate the beauty, right? I think there's a way that we hear so much about the gays, right? I think there's a way to not necessarily depoliticize it, but to think about beauty for beauty's sake. I think it's okay, and I think it's good. So this is an interesting, I found this amazing book, which is called She's So Fine, Reflections on Whiteness, Femininity, Adolescence, and Class in 1960s Music, which is edited by Lori Strass, S-T-R-A-S. And the cover is actually this image. So this is Dusty Springfield on the right and Martha and the Vandellas. And this is they were invited by Dusty to be on her show, hence you can see the big letters, and they flew out to the UK. And apparently there's some kind of a Motown event, and it was Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, the Supremes and the Miracles, all in the same plane, flying in the UK. That must have been pretty incredible. But I was interested in the relationship between Dusty and Martha and the Vandellas. So Dusty covered a lot of the songs, and she was in the UK making this sort of like deep, soulful music that was really inspired by and linked to Motown and Black culture, but she was also so separated from it, right? But from all the research that I've been doing, she was actually they had a really interesting relationship, and they really worked well together. They had a very loving relationship. So I found that really interesting. And also during this time, you didn't see a lot of images that were sort of, for lack of a better word, integrated. So there's something just really, really profound, and I think I'm still sort of mining that. So let's get to our group, the Rhinos, who we couldn't come up with a name. But there was a woman named Bobby at Vogue Fabrics in Evanston, and she said, "Oh, y'all should be the Rhinettes." Like rhinestones, yeah, that would be excellent. So here we are at Prosser. We sort of move around in Prosser depending on where we can find space. And Courtney Bradshaw, by the way, is standing back by the doors, working with the Gales. So I don't know, I really love this photo. We should also mention that so our skirts are still being sewn, things are still coming together, and the end product of this, the sort of materiality or the material thing that's going to come from this is a 16mm film that's going to be shot at Prosser on the stage. But please come out on the 24th, and we will give you more information about that shortly. This photo I absolutely love. Like it's blurry, but in a really sort of interesting, angelic way. This is Alexis. Oh, and the leotards they're vintage. They're from 1960. And this is y'all, I have not even posted this. This is like top secret. So this is Ann Higgins, and she's helping to put the costumes together. We're really excited, and this will be part of the performance on the 24th at Silent Funny, which is a space, it's a multi-use art space in West Homo Parks on Chicago Avenue. So bands perform there, there's performance stuff that goes on, and then artists are also involved, and there's an open house. So, and we also have some cars that are going to be involved in this process. So it should be a lot of fun, and I think we're pretty excited about it. So that's kind of where we're at. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, thank you all for sharing your incredibly interesting projects. And listening to you, I was thinking, wow, they're not only just artists and curators, they're also really good storytellers and documenters of people and places. So I think we have a little bit of time for a discussion. I'm just going to pose a few questions and we'll open it up to the audience. I want to bring us back to place. So especially with Tracie, you were talking about familiarity and some of the connections you felt with the West Side. And I'm just wondering if all of you could speak a little bit more about why the West Side. What difference does it make that you're doing this work on the West Side, with the West Side, about the West Side, engaged, or does it make any difference at all? How does it impact what you're doing specifically? I just wanted you to talk a little bit more deliberately about those kind of place-based connections or site-specific connections, if you can. And if you could just turn your mics around. Perfect.
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking a little bit about where the gallery is. So the gallery is at really sort of East Pilsen, and you go a couple streets east and you're in Chinatown, and you go a couple of streets west and you're deeper into Pilsen. But there's also to the highway, and so what I have really enjoyed about, and what draws me, I think, because I think I have lived longer my time in Chicago on the West Side than probably any other part of Chicago. What draws me, I think, is sort of the intersection of all of these different communities. So where I am, there's a large homeless population that has been there, that's vested, that we wave, that can tell me, hey, somebody came by, you weren't there, I told them goodbye 15 minutes, that, supports the gallery in terms of definitely, it's almost like a psychic connection, because sometimes like a chair will appear or a stool or something that, because they know that at some point it can be used and integrated into the gallery and the show. Also, too, I think that one of the first things that happened for me is that when I began to really sort of take the approach of root work, a lot of folks in the community, Mexican American, came and would talk a little bit about their own healing ritual practices. Right away, they saw what was happening, and we still have those types of conversations. And then there is within the part, there's an African American presence. There's a gallery next door to me that's run by a collective of African American men, and and then there also too is an old white community that's lived there. There is still some Polish roots, and then there are a lot of people who are newcomers. I think one of the things, though, as I think about sort of like that multiracial kind of conglomeration, one of the things, though, that I think appeals to me about where I am also, and maybe one of the things that I probably feel a little bit less comfortable, I still have this sort of like questionable relationship with the middle class. And or with any kind of elitism, if you come into the gallery and if you get there early, you're doing something, right? You may speak, you may sing, you may, whatever it is. If I know that you have any kind of talent, or you may bring something, people know that they bring food, they bring those kinds of things. I think that there is something, when I talk about familial, that is really what's important to me. And I think that the West Side, even though we know Chicago is heavily segregated, I think that there are some pockets on the West Side of deep adjacency and where communities are still crisscrossing. And that reminds me a lot of where I grew up in Los Angeles, because I tell people all the time that the LA that I grew up in, especially Watts, you know, when you look at the riots, you would think it's just black and white. But the reality is that there obviously was a very old Chicano community. There was a black migrant community, but there was also a white bohemian and also like a homeless community too, that all lived together. And then all points in between, a sort of Jewish middle class with stores and all these kinds of things. So I kind of grew up in this neighborhood where there are a lot of different types of stories. And I'm not going to even, you know, Cuba was happening then too. So I guess the thing that kind of like connects me to the West Side, and I'm not saying that this doesn't also exist in other parts of Chicago, but is that there is this idea that yes, it belongs to each successive wave of immigrants that kind of claim it, but also kind of belongs, it's a narrative that's elastic. And so that's something that I kind of, relate to. I'm really interested to hear what other people say about that, but I feel like that's more, it doesn't feel as concrete as some other places.
God, I think about this in a couple different ways because I've been involved in the schools because my kids go there. I mean, it's a community that you're in, and you fight for it, and you love it, and it's your beloved community that you build. And so I feel really obligated on one hand. And then, like I said probably 100 times, I'm like completely obsessed with this exciting story. It's like elusive and way more thrilling than some of the stories I've heard of these like remote, long ago, distant student-led movements. This one hasn't been told really, aside from about one paragraph that repeats in a couple of different sources. But I mean, the time and the place, 23rd and 23rd place in California, that's like a block away from Cook County Jail, right? They took their eyes off, the law enforcement that was like working really hard to keep this specific thing from happening, right? That they then came back and quashed with the Red Squad. But they worked really hard to keep this kind of a thing from happening, right? From student organizers, third generation organizers to be organizing in middle school. Then when they get to high school from all these different places, bam, of course, this like intense thing happens. I don't want to call it magic, but I mean, the stars were aligned when a certain group of people were together, and it couldn't have really happened in another place, right? I think between like the different communities coming together, the times, right? Like the big uprisings where the Latinx students marched out in solidarity after writing manifestos in parallel, in solidarity, not one, but they knew that they had different needs. Like that's some sophisticated organizing. That's the stuff that we need to have now. But, we have to figure out what was happening then to be able to put it to work. I was really interested in the fact that the students at Benito Juarez kind of had the sort of safer version of what had happened. They knew a little bit about it, but they didn't know everything about it. And like in these times, it's tough times right now. The more that you have available to you that you can use to make sense of what's happening now, the better, right? And in this case, students were everybody has been feeling a lot of despair and helplessness and anger. And in the past, when people have felt despair and helplessness and anger, these are some of the things they did, And so students have like really seized on it and, taken it and like to a place I couldn't have done late at night on eBay. But it's the convergence of this past and the present and this future imagining, I think, that is also in this sort of an intersection in the city at the same time, which we've already talked a little between us maybe about how the West Side in that area of town is like contentious, but yeah. I hope I answered the question.
Sure. So I think for me, working on the West Side is important because, as a person who's who has been living there for a few years now. Spent most of my formative years on the southwest side of Chicago in Ashburn. I think that I wanted to see more work out there about things that I wasn't seeing, right? So academia, we know how those structures of privilege and how they function, and I wasn't seeing very many cross-cultural conversations. I certainly wasn't seeing joyful Black women. There was a sort of realness missing from, I would say, my art education. And so as an outsider, trying to perpetually figure out how I fit in, especially when there's only two conversations people ever want to have with me. It's, are you an appropriator, and why are you doing this? And I think there's Ashton T. Crawley, who's a Black scholar, said, he's talking about otherwise possibilities, right? So thinking about this idea that it is possible to have these kind of conversations, and if we're not having them, things are never going to change. Like, it's not going to change the way that people think about and look at Chicago. We're not the headlines. Yes, there's those painful things, but there's also this celebration here, and those things are really important to me. And trying to figure out the ways to sort of insert my narrative into these spaces, right? And I'm still figuring that out, still sort of wading through that. Mm-hmm. So the West Side is just an important place, and there's so much creativity there, and I just want to offer that up to the world.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of labor, too, that I just quickly wanted to say, because as Nicole is talking and giving us so much history, and, as Sarah's talking about, how do you sort of, in some ways, dismantle the kind of, privilege that you can sometimes sort of feel yourself a part of, or propagate, sometimes, because it is kind of othering, or it kind of looks at experiences in such a sort of objective way that it, feels othering. One of the things that I sort of relate to, and I related to, this morning, is that, I really am a worker. I approach everything that I do like I have to do a good job, and that it has to be generative, that it really has to support people. And what I love and what I relate to very much in the various neighborhoods that I've lived in around the West Side is that, you enter in that way with folks, so that, in the gallery right away, a neighbor came and, said, hey, I'm the one who washes these windows, and I wash them, at this particular time, and this is how much, I'm paid. Okay. And, the paletas man, comes, and he knows that I love tamarindo. So when he sees me, we know what's about to happen. And then Evelina's Tamales at 814 West 18th Street. She just won Mole de Mayo, right? So she looked at me very suspect when she saw that I was coming from, and she asked me, what did you think about everybody else's mole? And I knew what to say. You're the one. I knew you were going to win. Somebody had to shove something in my mouth because, no one makes mole like you do. And she was pleased. And then when it was my birthday, she said, you didn't have your birthday here. And she knew, because she'd asked me when we first met. So there is this sort of way of being, and that also too of just that if you're going to claim space, you have to give something. It's reciprocal. And I think that is because of the successive waves of people who have had to make the community. And I think that community making is still a process. Community keeping is one of the really important questions of the day. But I do think that I got this sense when I came to 645 West 18th Street, that I had to make the folks in the community understand what I was up to, that they had to feel good about it, that they had to be proud of it, and that the door needed to be open. And I think that it kind of grounds the sort of like dialectic or the dialogical aspect of the gallery, which is about this continuous conversation with my grandmother and others. It makes it a community conversation. And I think that has everything to do with where it is.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about that. I think positioning is a really important question when you're talking about neighborhood history and neighborhood change. So thinking about how you acknowledge your connections to the West Side. I mean, I'm an outsider from West Coast, from Tracie and I are from the same area originally, same hometown. And as the staff knows, and other colleagues, I'm obsessed with the West Side. Probably thinking, Tracie, what you said, probably for the same reasons why I've become, attracted to the West Side. But there, that's a very outsider position. So I'm just wondering how you think about outsiderness and insiderness in the context of gentrification and self-determination, and creating platforms or creating space or listening or figuring out your role in that you're like you said, Tracie, you're entering in, you're being invited in. How you balance that, or what you think about in your work, and how it informs your work.
I was going to say what you said about putting in the work. I think that's what has really been what has allowed me to stay and say where I am living is my community. I was sort of held at an arm's length for several years. But I came here to Chicago from Michigan. I'm originally from Texas, and I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I've moved to Chicago several times, back and forth. But I came here to stay because I was brought here to be an institutional liaison between SAIC and Little Village Lawndale School, the art school. And Little Village Lawndale, just while we're talking about the West Side, actually has a mission that and a neighborhood boundary line that is very intentional about who is included, right? Like they wanted to stop what had been happening when schools had been granted permission to build that would keep them segregated, right? Which I'm sort of getting at with what happened with Benito Juarez, right? When the students started to say, well, wait, we're studying all this, but why aren't there Black people at our school? Mm-hmm. Right. That's what we need to get to and talk about and look at the policies that granted that school at that time in when they broke ground in the 70s. I think that one of the doors that opened to me came when I have a 5-year-old. Well, the first time that I was very visibly pregnant walking around in my neighborhood, right? Having a teenager was a little iffy, but the first time I was walking around and people saw me and, shoveling out my car pregnant, and they were like, oh, you're really here. Yeah, that's a sure sign. So I guess I don't get all the credit for that, but
how about yourself?
Well, I mean, putting in the hours and really being open, I think, to critiques and a lot of this, and then later this was, I think, I gave it time, and I was pretty excited and glad-handing a lot, and just so happy to see everybody. And everybody was kind of suspicious of me for about the first 5 years, and then I think putting in the work makes the difference, 100%. Sincerity goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, I can speak to that. It's funny because when I tell other people about my project who maybe don't know me super well, they think, well, how can you be going in there and doing it, and you're just plucking out these people? And I'm like, no, these are actually girls I go to church with. We all know each other's families. So Anya, not to put you on the spot, but her dad was like, thank you. She came up to me after church. Thank you for including Anya in your project. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Why are you thanking me? She's doing me this incredible favor and, making the project incredible. And so I feel like there's this reciprocity, right, where we all know each other, we know each other's families. I know what kind of sandwiches your dad likes to make. So just those hoagie sandwich things. So just sort of building relationships with one another, right? And also being there for the stuff that's really hard. So even though this is, we're talking about the West Side, and I don't want to necessarily go right to violence, but being at funerals for people who've been murdered, and just trying to support people and make change. So recently, my husband and I, we were living in West Humboldt, and we moved to the Oak Park side of Austin. Yeah, the Austin neighborhood. And so that disparity, that border, we're all talking about borders. It's so clear, right? And I feel like I'm, even just living on the other side, I'm sort of complacent, right, in a way that I'm not satisfied with. And I'm not satisfied with the conversations that are being had about it. There's a book that recently came out about Austin Boulevard. And maybe some people in here aren't familiar with it, but it's a dividing line between Oak Park and Chicago. And, the Austin side is mostly Black, and the yards aren't manicured in quite the same way. And then the Oak Park side is very manicured, and there's a little bit more diversity, but I would say more white. And so that there's something about that street that is so striking to me. And so asking myself even questions like, okay, yeah, we're making this girl group and it's wonderful, but like, what else can I do? Right? Because we all talk about change and we post about change on Facebook, but what are we doing? Right?
So I'm going to ask right back at you. Yeah. So what are you, seriously, there's incredible, we all talked about that, there's incredible under-recognized disparity on the West Side. And so people don't often think of arts as connected with any sort of, economic development, community development, or, but I'm wondering how you, in all of your work, are addressing directly or indirectly the inequity. I know, Tracie, you talked about how there's an increasing number of people of color gallery owners in the area where you're working, but thinking about like how places are supporting inequity or trying to correct inequity. I'm wondering if you all could speak to that a little bit.
I always feel like if I go first and I'm not going to say, I hear something, I'm like, oh my God, I want to say that. One thing I wanted to say really quickly that has been on my mind, and I think about this whenever I think about sort of like what is the difference in terms of me having a gallery, which is admittedly based on a very sort of eclectic premise. One thing I think about is when I was setting the second show with the artist, with Victor, we will work late into the night because we're working, so I'm not a full-time curator. I work and I'm, I'll meet the artist. We may meet at 7 or 8 if we can't meet on the weekend. And we're setting that show sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, depending on how hard things are to hang or the kind of conversation we want to have about the work. But I remember when we opened the show, which was September 9th, I never will forget, 2016, a woman comes in with her CTA bus uniform. And she said, I only have 15 minutes, but I knew when you were going to open, I had to find out, some things. I went online because I've been seeing you to talk, for the last week and a half. And I've been seeing things go up, and I knew I had to be here for the opening. And she went around, she looked at everything, she took some pictures. And when it was time for her to go, I was talking to a lot of people, and she just waved and did the thumbs up. And then she got on her post, and then she went to the bus. So the other day, today, when we were putting up the Alexandra Antoine show, I am now upstairs in the studio working. It's like really early in the morning, and I see a bus, the whole CTA bus, pull up to the side of the gallery, and I knew it was her, that she wanted to see what was happening in the show. I think that that's a West Side Story, because I think that there's something that she knows, that she is my most righteous audience, that if it looks good to her, if it's worth her doing all she needs to do to see it, I think that that's important. And that to me is what I am trying to do. Growing up in Watts, we had some of the most incredible artists, and I'm not making that up, and using Quincy Troop, Wanda Coleman. I grew up with people who were, I'm a Black Arts Movement baby. So I grew up with people who, and with definitely a lot of people who were culture workers. I use that term to kind of reclaim it. Who are Latino and Asian and all these other kinds of things. So growing up for me, I'm not trying to set out to prove that artists can live everywhere and in every condition, because we know that that's true. But what I think I'm trying to do, and I also want to say that me being where I am is very organic. There was nothing like I'm thinking, how can I make this a social practice movement? No, what I really said is, where should this gallery be? And there it appeared. But the thing that I can say about it is that all of these different realities that we're talking about, and all these intertwining realities, for me, just reinforce that genius lives everywhere, that artists live everywhere, that the folks who kind of have to qualify the art they make are very interesting and rarefied, but that most creative people make constantly. It is an iterative practice, and it is a communal practice, and it usually involves some type of dialogue. And at the end of the day, they usually don't hang it up or put it on a wall and say, this is art. They are just living and making. And so I think that, if anything, going back to my grandmother, who was not a trained artist, but who was someone who was constantly curating our home, including putting things that were happening in the news, if she thought that it was really important or very interesting, she would actually basically wheat paste it, like graffiti black, onto the walls, and you couldn't get them off. So I grew up reading the home. So when I come into the show, when I'm setting up a show, I always say to folks, we got to read the show. What should the show say from right to left? And reading the show. I also say lacing, that we got to lace the track, because I'm a hip hop kid too. So when the show is set, I'm like, how do we bring it off the walls? When somebody comes in, let's let them trip on some okra and say, why are okra here? The okra is here because this is the land of okra. Okra transcends a lot of different types of nationalities and a lot of different type of racial experiences. And it creates this, we all kind of come together in okra, and is also very culturally specific in terms of where it comes from. So I guess in terms of what we're trying to do, the practice has to be about love, because I think at the base of making art, when you really have made, what you understand is that your ego, when it's good stuff, you don't even think about it. You just want more and more people. You want to open it up, and there's this level of generosity. What I'm trying to do with Rootwork is to make, on a particular corner, a beacon of love. And I also want to give some shout out to some of the best greens that I've had and homemade biscuits that I've had. I don't want to get in trouble because I like to eat a lot of different places. So, but I also want to talk about food culture, which is also too very connecting. And I think that you have a lot of different kinds of cultures, food cuisines and cultures and food ways lined up on the West Side in a way that you can go from one cuisine to another cuisine to another cuisine. And I love that too.
I have to say, when we were working on the very small buildings, we talked a lot about food, because the students were making this pizza place, and they were like, well, which one do you go to? Do you go to that Pizza Nova? Oh, I don't go to that one. And many conversations were about back of the yards, all these places that I hadn't heard of, versus, oh, you didn't know that they had another one that's over there on 47th. You have to check it out. But it's about those tiny conversations, and hearing about the details and seeing people's expressions as they, share stories. I'm not really sure how that is in terms of, affecting the economics. But as a person who grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, after I'm fourth, possibly in some places, fifth generation San Antonio person, right? Being from Texas, my parents fled the South for reasons not unrelated to, it being just a get the hell out of Texas and not go back kind of it's the South, y'all know. And I didn't really grow up feeling like I belonged anywhere. And so where I am now, I've never felt like this before. I've never felt like I had a place or I had a really distinct role. And like sometimes I'm like a little too overjoyed about it, and people are like, being Midwestern and like just relax, low key about it. But I am finding that the low key part, I just want to like blow it up all the time because there's so many incredible, talented people that have been like not talked about. I ask people about it and they say, well, why are you asking so much? And I was like, speak into the recorder. I'm going to transcribe it, and I think putting in the work is part of it, but also too, like just, being in art school for a really, really, really long time, since '88. One thing that you cultivate is like the ability to spot amazing stuff. Like what you're left with is taste, really good taste, or your particular taste, or whatever it is, stuff that you're just like absolutely passionate about that you can just become completely obsessed with. And that's what I'm applying to this. Because it came to me. I mean, I wouldn't say it's something I chose. It does help me, make small talk at the laundromat. But I'm not sure. I think that when the students are really outraged that the story hasn't been taught to them, or these stories that they're helping put together through, piecing together all these newspapers, when they become outraged about it not being taught, and then they go tell everybody they know, it's going to pay, maybe not in cash, but over time, I think.
I have one more question and then I'll open it up to the audience. One of the things that I noticed that's sort of a thread through all of your projects you've discussed was women and gender and women from the past. So mothers, grandmothers, cultural workers, 1960s icons. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more of why or how that is taking center stage. We heard a little bit from Tracie and how it helped you open the entire gallery, the connection, but why women, I guess?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So for me, it's this thing, I think there's a lot of tension in those spaces, or at least now politically, like looking back at those spaces, right? We're like, oh, the respectability politics, or oh, the gender politics, or the spaces that they occupy, and I'm interested in that tension because I think a lot of times people sort of disregard those groups because they see them as frilly or artificial or like somehow not important. Maybe because, they think about them in relationship to larger bands. They're like, well, these people didn't play instruments. What did these people do? Well, they're using their voices, right? And I'm so interested in the voice as an instrument. It's connected to the body and all my work about the body. So even as, investigating something that might be, especially from a feminist standpoint, considered kind of taboo, and sort of mining the possibilities of those spaces. That's important to me.
I teach teachers, so I'm very interested in women's labor, especially under-recognized women's labor, as a school teacher myself, and also as one of very few women of color, especially established on the tenure track at SAIC. I've been left out plenty, and now I like to go back and find the women who paved all these paths for me. One person I'm really looking out for, and I just want to put it out there, a woman named Sharon Matthews, who was the co-organizer of the citywide walkouts. I have not found her, but it was her and Victor Addams that engineered these citywide shutdowns. And, I would like to study her in books. They haven't been written, but I'm if I have to see if I have to hear anybody else talking about the Chicago mural movement and leaving women, particularly Latinx women, out, I'm going to die. I will literally die. I can't write about it, look at it, talk about it, think about it if it doesn't have women included, especially the women who we know were there because they're in the pictures, right? I just can't. That's my motivation.
Yeah. And I love that, because I think one of the ironies of, this conversation that, all the things I'm talking about here today and that I talk about and I've been talking, really focusing on for several years, and then just really talking a lot about more within the context of the gallery, is that when my grandmother was alive, when my grandparents were alive, I really was like a magnet to my grandfather, because my grandfather was very effusive, and he was, like really, in a lot of ways, like very sort of demonstrative in his affection and, and generous in that kind of way that grandfathers give you change and things like that. And my grandmother, on the other hand, was really a steward of the house, and she made sure that you lived, and she made sure that you, had baths, and she made sure that you got to school. But I think what is interesting to me is that is that quiet story, that the kind of labor and the kind of work that she did is now being, I'm celebrating it. And, when we launched, I had postcards of my grandmother, that image that you have there. She's at her mother's funeral, and the look on her face, and actually the look in her siblings' eyes, it just talks to the kind of strength that my grandmother had, but also the softness, because, her eyes are so watery there. But people come in all the time to the gallery and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I have your grandmother's picture on my altar." "Oh yeah, I was looking at your grandmother's picture today." Or they know my grandmother's name. And I think that what is happening is that I'm hoping that all that I know about my grandmother and all that I don't know, all the things that I asked about her right before she was passing away, I had some time to spend in Los Angeles. I asked her lots of questions. But what I'm hoping is that in addition to her own rich history and complexity and brilliance, generosity, and obviously her artfulness and her elegance, I'm hoping that I am, pushing people whose parents or mothers or grandparents or grandmothers specifically, or aunts, are living, who may not have these huge voices at home, that they're beginning to sort of ask the questions and say, who is this woman? Because in me finding out more about my grandmother, I have learned and unpacked my own identity a lot more as a woman, especially of what I can do with my power and how that looks in community, and really showing up in that particular way. So, it is critical, because each of those women in those photographs, they represent an extraordinary history, not only of the West Side, but what it means to be a woman in the contemporary, society in general. And of course, Jane Addams, is that makes me think a lot of Jane Addams.
Okay, that's a good point to open up. Are there any questions or comments from the audience?
I'm really curious by the way that research works for all of you in your practice. A little bit like archives is in the title today, but it seems like people are a big part, like these living resources, people are maybe no longer living but still somehow available to us. Like you used the word Tracie, information coming to us in different ways. So I was just wondering if you could speak to how you might define some expanded version of the idea of research in your work.
I'm going to be quick because I'm, excited and talking. Research for me is important. It's critical for me in everything I do, but also in shows. So the show that we have now called Diaspora, which is looking at the connection, as I said, between Haiti and Chicago, which begins with Du Sable, but extends, so much more. It led me to begin thinking about Nicole Smith, who up until 2011, was one of the most important Black gallerists in Chicago, and probably for some, one of the most important gallerists in general in terms of if you can have a gallery for 3 years, you're good. That's golden. But she supported herself by having a gallery for 25 years, and they began in her home. And she had started as a curator in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and then came to Chicago, and she broke the careers or opened up the careers and gave the first shows and introduced folks to collectors for many African-American, because, you know, we have a very large African population, West African population here now, East African population, but also Caribbean artists. And so I knew in the back of my mind that, you know, Nicole had been here. And I remember going to the gallery maybe once or twice when, you know, I was, you know, younger a little bit. But that information downloaded once again, because now I have this show where the artist is Haitian. And so the Haitian American Museum of Chicago, which is on Racine, which means roots. You know, I saw that Elsie Hernandez, who is a Haitian woman who started the gallery, who's also a nurse. And then we started talking about Nicole, and it turns out that before her death, Nicole had given her all of these paintings for safekeeping to help build up the museum. And so then we both looked at each other, and she said, would you like to borrow one of the paintings so that you can tell the story of Nicole? And so someone comes into the gallery, I'm speaking fast because all these different things are happening, but Pride of Place is Ville Imaginaire, which is the Imaginary City by Fritz Milvois, which is a prize painting that Nicole Smith had, and it's in this place, and really there's a lot of reverence for the ancestors around that. So if you look at it, you can sort of see if you know those symbols. But that was important for me, and I built that around because I really wanted to observe and pay my obeisance to, you know, the energy of this creative woman. And then right above the altar in another space is a photograph of her. And it's not screaming, but if you know her history, you come in and you can see it. And it was really interesting because a man comes into the gallery, he looks around, and then he finds me and he turns to you. He said, I see that you were coming after Nicole. What an honor. But I would say with each show, it leads me to ask certain types of questions, and it's been leading me to people here in Chicago. It's just interesting. So I think, the unexamined life is not worth living. So I think in art, you have to ask deep questions. And then you begin to realize, and this is said so much these days, but each person is an archive. There are so many people with this information stored. And if you go to the right person and ask the right question, they just pour out like a river. And that's really happened with me each show. But again, another incredible woman, another iconic woman whose history needs to be told is the history of Nicole Smith and how she would become, in her space, one of the primary gallerists, and creating all these microeconomies from artists who really built a patronage that allowed them to work, if not full-time as artists, then, at least to work and sell their artwork.
Any other questions or comments? We are going to close with